Arlene Foster's then special advisor wrote the email in the summer of 2015. Sam McBride, 24 hours, Friday, November 17, 2017. Most people in the renewable energy industry quickly realized that the RHI scheme was too good to be true, but expected Arlene Foster's department to rein it in, a Femana businessman has said. In evidence yesterday put before the public inquiry into the disastrous green energy scheme, Neil Elliott said that he was aware the scheme was flawed not long after its launch. The comments from Mr. Elliott, who runs Future Renewable Energy Systems, were read to the inquiry by barrister Donald Lunny as he closed the opening legal statements ahead of the first witnesses being called to appear in just over a week's time. Mr. Lunny, who is junior counsel to the inquiry, said Mr. Elliott had been sent a question by the inquiry about potential loopholes in the RHI system. Industry expected Stormont to act. Mr. Elliott had then replied, like most of the renewable industry, we were aware that the Northern Ireland scheme was flawed not long after its launch. No actions were taken as we thought that the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Investment would cap the scheme or amend the scheme to the same scheme as the UK mainland. We did not communicate any potential flaws in the scheme to anyone, but it was widespread knowledge within the renewable industry that the incentive was too good to be true. The evidence is consistent with that which has been referred to at the inquiry last week, when it was told that one firm was literally marketing the scheme as cash for ash and another company had within 4 weeks of the scheme launching worked out just how lucrative it was and was promoting it as a means to make profit. However, the last week the inquiry was told that it had taken another 3.5 years for civil servants to work out the problem. Foster's SPAD predicted disastrous spike. It has also emerged in written evidence obtained by the inquiry that Mrs. Foster's former special advisor SPAD Andrew Crawford predicted in July 2015, the point at which another DEP SPAD, Timothy Kearns, has said he was trying to delay cost controls on behalf of the party, that there would be a massive spike in applications to the scheme before cost controls. That spike subsequently happened, with disastrous consequences for the public purse. In an email sent to Mr. Kearns on the 31st of July 2015, 2.5 months before cost controls were finally implemented, Mr. Crawford argued that the first, more lucrative tier proposed as part of the cost controls should be more than doubled to 3,000 hours, something which the civil service ultimately said could not be justified. The inquiry has already heard that at least one of Mr. Crawford's relatives, Richard Crawford, is an RHI claimant and that he forwarded civil service information about looming cost controls to him in mid-2015. Richard Crawford installed boilers in September 2015. In the email to Mr. Kearns, Mr. Crawford, who resigned as a DEP SPAD in January, said there is going to be a massive spike in applications before the 1st of October, at that point the planned date for cost controls. There is currently a shortage of the necessary pipework required to install boilers. SPAD asked colleague to table question. Other documentation released by the inquiry reveals that the previous year, while he was Mrs. Foster's SPAD, Mr. Crawford emailed DEP MLA William Irwin late at night on the 19th of September 2014 with the subject written question. The email said, question for DEDI. Does DEDI have any plans to reduce the level of renewable heat incentive RHI for new commercial biomass boilers? 3 days later, Mr. Irwin tabled the assembly question and requested a priority response. The response, prepared by officials and issued in the name of Mrs. Foster after receiving her approval, came back to say that there are no proposals in the then recent consultation to reduce incentives. In January, the DEP said that Mr. Irwin's son-in-law is an RHI claimant but that he had never lobbied on his behalf. It is not clear why Mr. Crawford appears to have suggested that Mr. Irwin send a question to the department in which he was then a senior figure. Officials hoovering up assurances. Today's inquiry hearing focused on the period in which the scheme was set up in 2011 and 2012. Damuna O'Brien, a former senior civil servant in Whitehall, who was appointed by inquiry chairman Sir Patrick Coghlan to join him on the panel which will hear evidence, yesterday at unimpressed about some of the evidence which has come before the inquiry as to how the RHI scheme was approved, seemingly going through a host of checks and individuals, yet with none of them spotting its flaws. She said, I mean, you could be forgiven for thinking that people were just hoovering up assurances from others as a way of saving themselves from having to look at the detail. We've yet to see any evidence of people starting to ask difficult questions or going to the original documents from the ground up. It seems to be that if that person says okay, then I can say it's okay without any value add. Well, want to understand what value mostly internal civil service committees and individuals were adding to the scrutiny. questions about what Foster was told. The inquiry was also told by Mr. Lunny that Mrs. Foster's officials had on several occasions given her, and others, written assurances that they would review the RHI scheme, something intended to reduce the risks involved with the scheme and something which, if they had happened, might have spotted the perverse incentive on offer. Referring to one submission to Mrs. Foster, Mr. Lunny said the issue is whether the minister was ever made aware of the picture in terms of the costs of the proposed scheme, or would it only have come to her attention if she had read the CEPADETI's consultant's report in news. http://sinews.co.uk